Ashen was one of the best games of 2018 in my opinion, and when A44 announced Flintlock Siege of Dawn, they had my attention. How do you follow up one of the best indie Souls-like games ever? Flintlock the Siege of Dawn tries to capture some of those same highs, an incredibly tight and satisfying combat system, some complex bosses, and a brand new world and story to get lost in. Flintlock definitely gets a lot right, and when it doesn't get it right, it doesn't overstay its welcome.
The god you unleashed is called Uru. It is his army of the dead that has been laying waste to Dawn, the source of all your suffering.
And how is it that you know all of this?
Because I am a god too.
Let me know any questions you have about the game in the comments down below and I'll get back to you. Let's start with the graphics and performance. Now, I am playing on a PC with a 4090, so my mileage will definitely vary to yours, so I don't want to spend too much time talking about this, but it runs absolutely flawlessly. Now, it does have DLSS and apparently frame gen. There is an option for it in the settings, but I wasn't able to turn it on and I couldn't figure out why, but you don't really need it here. So with my general setup here, I was able to hit like 120 frames just consistently throughout the game with no hitches, everything on ultra, and didn't have any issues. I actually tried turning it off and still having the game everything set to ultra and just turning DLS off, and I was still hitting about 45 FPS. So there is definitely a lot of good optimization that has occurred here, and I would fully expect it to run quite well on console systems and other systems that aren't like mine. So it does seem like a lot of optimization has occurred here. I do, however, think that Flintlock is lacking some sort of visual identity in some way. Now, this is an incredibly good looking video game, right? Like, don't get me wrong here. I'm not saying this is like an ugly game to look at. It's just that it's missing some sort of unique visual flair that when you look at the game, you know exactly what game you're looking at. To give you an example, right, with Ashen, you can see Ashen, you know exactly what that game is because of its just incredible art design, and like the charm of that world is just so strong that it like oozes off the screen here. Whereas with Flintlock, you don't get that same notion here. They've lent into more of a realistic art style that obviously still looks incredible here, but it's just lacking some of that visual identity that I think really came through with Ashen. And I think that that's maybe just part of the studio trying to make a bit more of a mainstream and a bit larger of an experience here than what Ashen was by creating something with this realistic art style that they have done here. And I do love some of the enemy and especially the boss designs. Like some of the main bosses just have an absolutely incredible look to them and unique mechanics, which we'll touch on a little bit later as well. But there's definitely something here. It just doesn't hit that same high in terms of its graphical and artistic vision, in my opinion, that Ashen did.
I bet I could run along the top of it, flit across the paddles.
Bet you whatever's in my pocket, you'll be in the river in a minute.
What's in your pocket?
All right, let's talk about the gameplay itself. Now, there are two like major zones that operate like open world areas that you can freely explore and do side quests, find hidden chests for gear and all that like typical things. These areas have a ton of verticality, which is absolutely fantastic because it allows you to leverage the fantastic movement mechanics that you have here. You have like a double jump plus an air dash. Then there are these rifts that you can use to like zoom around areas and get up higher or lower or like access areas once you've unlocked the shortcuts, etc. But there's plenty of movement that you'll be doing throughout Flintlock, which just has such a great flow to it as you're moving around and doing some of these platforming puzzles or just playing the game and you're up really high and you're like, oh, I wonder if I can get down there and find something down there, or vice versa, like looking upwards. Both of these two major areas, there are more by the way, it's just two major open world areas, are contained with an overall size and scope without too much like padding of that like open worldy stuff, right, where you just wander around in like blank spaces just to like increase the game's overall runtime. Beyond the odd hamlet, which is like an enemy camp that you might actually need to clear, I actually enjoyed these a lot, by the way, because it really helps with some of the game's pacing by giving you some tougher areas with like a little mini boss at the end. When you're actually out exploring, it's usually like one or two enemies that you'll run into together, which are very easy to beat, and having these hamlets just gives you a bit more challenge in those areas. Now, it took me about 22 hours to complete the game, all the side quests. I collected most of the hidden banner collectibles and did half of the SEBO games because, oh my gosh, I really did not like SEBO. Now, this is a coin board game that runs on like a triangle-based system that essentially you need to create a triangle with your coins to essentially like win your offensive round, and then on the defensive round, you need to prevent your like AI opponent from doing the same thing. This game has very little depth and complexity that overall I feel like this shouldn't be in the game. I kind of understand why it's there to add a bit more uniqueness to the flair, a bit more of a pacing mechanic where you can do something different, but there isn't enough depth here or just general fun for it to really exceed, right? Especially when the rewards here for like actually winning these encounters is just like 1,000 reputation at its absolute max, which you can get from just hitting a few enemies. Like you don't get anything from that. You can get some unique coins by finding them in wells, which you can then use in these encounters, but it's just not enough complexity here or intelligence in the AI to create anything that's unique. Realistically here, like on your attack turns, you just need to get a coin in like the middle, and then you just essentially wait to see if the AI gets out of the way so that you can create your triangle, right? Sometimes the AI just like won't get out of the way. It'll just move its squares in the corner like back and forth for like waste all of your turns, and you just like physically cannot create a triangle, right? And then if you do pass that, you've then got to defend, which you just essentially do the same thing. Because these boards are so small, it's extremely easy to just see like, okay, there is like 3 spaces here that are the only way you can create a triangle. You just sit on those spaces for the entire game, and sometimes the AI will just literally move the same coin back and forth, and then you just wait for essentially the game to end, right? I just found this whole system and experience to be extremely disappointing, especially when you take into account the backing soundtrack in these moments, right? There's a lot of button presses just to even get into the game, and then you're sort of waiting, and it just hasn't got a really quick, sharp, snappy flow to it, which is just really disappointing when you think about some of the experiences that we get in these RPGs or action games. You're thinking of a Gwent or a Dragon's Blood from Rebirth, right? It seems like that's the direction that they've tried to go with what SEBO is, but there's, in my opinion, a failure to understand what makes those card games actually good. Anytime you win one of these encounters, you get a tangible reward, not just reputation. Also, the OST in those environments, like when you're just playing the card game, is just so strong that you want to stay in that mode, right, and play around with it. There's also a deck building element to that, and funny NPCs that you interact with that have some like just really funny and interesting dialogue when you talk to them that just really adds to the depth of the overall card game, makes it fun and enjoyable. And just SEBO doesn't have these moments or these highs in any way. There's no tournament, there's no end game to doing this. It's really just you find the coins in the wells and you get a little bit of reputation and a tick on the map to say that you've actually completed these encounters, and that's essentially it. But after the first region, I just decided to completely ignore SEBO and focus on the core gameplay itself. And when I did, man, did it sing. So I'm going to try and avoid too many comparisons to Ashen here. I've already talked about Ashen a couple of times. Like, I absolutely love that game, and this is the second game that A44 have released, so it's very hard not to draw comparisons from their only other title that they have. Now, Ashen was trying very hard to be a Dark Souls, but a more casual Souls-like experience. It oozed that visual flair and design flair that I was talking about. Flintlock's inspiration clearly isn't drawn from those same Dark Souls inspiration here. There are plenty of Souls elements. There is a very clear inspiration and connection to another game series that has a serious and brooding main character who wields a cool axe that's followed around by a little god with a semi-open world elements and like a strong action gameplay. Those comparisons really aren't lost on me, and I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. Like, the combat system here is definitely quite different to God of War, leaning into more of those Souls-like structures with reputation taking the place of Souls, but you can increase your reputation gain by avoiding taking damage, creating a bit more of a reward for your skillful gameplay when you can avoid damage, whether that be by parrying or interrupting or dodging. Now, combining those elements in ways in encounters is where some of that skill ceiling and the challenge comes into play, right? Now, when this is working really well, when you're getting those interrupt timings happening, so you interrupt those red attacks with like your firearm, or you're parrying these attacks with your axe and then follow up with counter attacks, or just like dodging out of attack animations, it does feel really good, but it does take a while to get to that point where it feels really strong and satisfying based on the progression in the skill system, which we'll touch on a little bit more later. But something that I did notice is that sometimes these combat telegraphs are very poorly shown. Like enemies will start winding up attacks and they won't have like the red indicator to say it's an interrupt attack, not a parry. That like indicator will appear very late in that attack animation, and then by that time that it has switched to a red indicator, it's like too late to actually interrupt it with your firearm, and you're like halfway through a parry animation or something and you just end up taking that damage. That can be quite frustrating, and I'm sure some of that stuff will get cleaned up in future patches, like once the game is out, but it was just something that I noticed sometimes that did cause some frustration if like I triggered the wrong sort of parry or interrupt, depending on what the animation was. When you do get those timings down, especially on certain bosses, the feedback here is just so good. Like it's got that really good rewarding feedback that you need from a parry system, where you feel like that dopamine hit from like triggering that parry, following up with that counter strike. One of my favorite bosses was one of the gods, where you have to trigger like a multiple parry to actually get like the counter attack, and just that animation when it's like swinging and happening, really loved the feedback and just how that felt. Like it was absolutely so strong. And it is a little disappointing how many unique encounters there are in Flintlock though. A lot of the new enemies as they're introduced will be some sort of a mini boss, and then you'll eventually see them just like out in the world and that sort of thing. And I think overall there's maybe 5 or 6 actual unique encounters that you only experience once in the game, and those are some of the absolute highlights of the game. In the exact same way it was with Ashen, A44 are absolutely incredible at creating these boss fights with unique mechanics that have really great backing soundtracks that, you know, feel so rewarding to actually fight. And all of these like major god fights and unique encounters, absolutely loved. I'm not going to show you all of them for spoilers, but they are really, really strong and some of the best content in the game that are really worth experiencing, especially once you have progressed and leveled up all of your skills. So speaking of those skills and progression systems, now you will gain that reputation like we touched on earlier, and if you die, you lose that reputation. You got to go back and grab that bad boy. But what's unique about this is that multiplier effect, right? That when you avoid damage, that multiplier goes up and you gain more reputation from fighting enemies and the likes. You also get reputation from completing main and side quests or some of the other smaller activities throughout the world. You'll get a little bit as well. This reputation can be spent in a multitude of ways. The primary way you'll spend it is on your skill points. You have the 3 skill trees here: powder, magic, and steel, all focusing on a specific part of NorZZa's kit. Powder for firearm, magic for the magic stuff with NK, and then steel for the actual melee attacks here. Now, as you progress and actually learn some of these skills and get further in the game, the combat system really comes together. You get a really strong sense of that progression element, especially once you start combining some of the gear you find and the armor synergy bonuses you get from there. I just like absolutely loved like the fire axe. I essentially used it throughout the entire game, just like set everyone on fire, had an absolute great time. And then I was also using NK's ability, one of the curse stones that can actually poison enemies. So I was burning them, I was poisoning them, and I did feel a strong connection to that progression element as it did eventually come together, which in the early stages of the game, especially before you get that double jump and the air dash and stuff, it does feel kind of clumsy and clunky. But once you get that point, start getting those skills and progressing, it does really come together. You can also spend this reputation on upgrading your weapons and your firearms, plus your long-range weapons and your grenades as well. There's just a whole lot of stuff in this like equipment kit, right? You've got 3 armor slots, you've got 2 melee weapons you can have equipped at any time, you've got 2 long-range weapons that you can equip at a time, you've got a pistol you can equip, you've got grenades, you've also got NK's abilities as well. There's just a lot of stuff here, while there's also not a whole lot of different gear you can get. There's about 5 to 6 different sets in total, and I would have liked if they, say for example, removed like the long range weapons, which I barely used and didn't feel connected to the rest of the combat experience, as you're only really going to use them before a combat encounter because of how slow a lot of their animations are, and they really take you out of the combat flow, where the pistol you can just use while you comboing with your like melee attacks and everything, and you can't really just like shoot something from a distance. And it is cool when you see that like, you know, slow motion shot when you use your musket and like one-shots enemies, but beyond that, that, there isn't really a whole lot of point to these long range weapons. Like, I just would have preferred them to maybe be removed in favor of creating more combat variety in terms of the melee weapons that are available to you, some of the armor sets, so you can create different synergies in that way. But even still, with the limited amount of sets and things you have available to you, there is a really strong combat system here that is really rewarding once you've unlocked a lot of these skills and combining the different explosion and magic elements, as well as some of the firearm skills that can be used together in like this really interesting, like chain together way that just is fun and really fills that like power fantasy feeling that you want from these like Souls-like action RPGs sort of games.
Bitter years since the dead broke through the door, I've promised you peace. Today, I'm making good on it.
So in Flintlock, you play as NorZZa, an elite member of the Coalition army joined by NK, a mysterious fox-like companion in their quest for vengeance against the gods. That's basically the overall setup here, and A44 have referred to this as like a Flintlock fantasy that they've essentially created. I did really like Nor and NK's relationship through the game. Like, Nor isn't your typical wisecrack main character that just cracks jokes the whole time. There is an intelligence and a maturity to Nor that's reflected in the way that they have actually been at war with the gods and the dead for quite some time here, and that's really shown in the way that she treats other people and even talks to NK. There's a seriousness about her in the way that she treats the world and herself as well, and she's not too afraid to have a joke with NK though once their relationship does build and they do connect. And
But you still look like a tiny fox thing.
Sandstorms would cease so I could pass. The sky would dim when I'd howl.
Then how?
Pardon?
I want to hear you. How?
you see that journey from their first meeting to the very end and the way that they kind of come together. And I enjoyed that story and learning about NK and the mystery behind him and the connection that he has to the other gods as well as Nor and the world itself. Now, the main story is quite easy to understand, but the overall world lore around that is quite difficult to understand or piece together, as it's not really given to you in any meaningful way. You will occasionally read notes and stuff that gives you some of that information, and there's a lot of hints and references to events in the past or connections between characters in the world that these people live in, but none of that exposition is actually given to you as the player. I would have liked maybe a tiny little bit more of that. I can see why it's not here in terms of actually just wanting to make a game that doesn't heavily rely on just like spitting out lore to you and stuff. It's not really the focus here, right? This is a journey between Nor and NK and their experiences as they go out into the world, as well as the combat, and it's not taking you out of that by just giving you massive exposition dumps. Totally get that, but I would have loved just like more of those little notes that you can find throughout the world that give you some of that more information if you want to go that route, but it doesn't force you to. Where Ashen stood on its own for its incredible art design and really tight combat system, A44 have aimed for a significantly more widespread appeal with Flintlock, with a defined main character and the cute little fox friend to sort of pull people in, referring to it more as an action RPG than a Souls-like. Though from the moment you play the game, you'll definitely feel those Souls-like elements, and trying to appeal to a more mainstream audience isn't a bad thing, right? Especially in the volatile games industry that we are currently in. I completely understand the decision, and as an absolute stan of Ashen and the incredible highs that that game achieves, I was a little let down in some of those elements in Flintlock that just didn't seem to receive those same highs. It is still a really good game that I do recommend you play, especially at that cheaper price point. A lot of the negatives here that I have touched on don't last too long, and you can avoid them like SEBO, like I mentioned as well. It's much easier to forgive some of those elements that don't reach those massive high points for a game that isn't $70 US or over $100 like most games are here in Australia, right? And obviously if you've got Game Pass, this is absolutely a must play. The combat system is worth the price of admission on its own, but let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Thank you guys for watching this video till the end. Thank you to our members for supporting the channel. My name is NorZZa, and I hope you have a great day.